19 traded for 60 sacks of winter wheat. Maeve stood silent as a treaty was signed to spare her kin from House Harrow's blades. They called him the Alpha King. To her people, he was simply the butcher. She brought no bags and shed no tears, merely rubbing the numbness from her hands as she braced for the inevitable. Yet when the silence of the great hall was finally broken, it wasn't by a snarl, but by the quiet, resonant utterance of her own name. The courtyard smelled of wet dog, sour ale, and desperation. Maeve stood by the wooden stakes of the inner perimeter, her bare toes curling into the freezing mud. It was late November, the kind of cold that didn't just bite at the skin, but settled deep into the marrow and made the joints ache. She wasn't shivering anymore. That was the worst part. When the shivering stops, the dying begins. Her brother, Gideon, stood 20 paces away, talking to a man wrapped in thick bear fur. Gideon was the alpha of Ashbourne now. Their father's chest had been crushed by a rogue bear 2 winters ago, leaving Gideon with a starving pack and a crumbling keep. Maeve watched the exchange of papers. The transaction. She was the transaction. No one looked at her. Not the guards flanking the gate, picking dirt from their nails, and certainly not the emissary from the north. The emissary handed Gideon a leather pouch. Coin. The wheat had already been unloaded by the eastern silos. Maeve had counted the sacks herself, her breath pluming in the frigid air. 60 sacks. It felt like a low price for a life. But then again, she had seen mothers in the village trade heirloom silver for a half-rotten cabbage. Hunger stripped the poetry from everything. Maeve. Gideon's voice was rough, scraped raw from cheap pipeweed and the constant gnawing stress of leadership. She didn't look at his eyes. She looked at his boots. They were splitting at the seams. "It's time," he said. He didn't offer an apology. She didn't want one. An apology would imply there was another choice, and they both knew there wasn't. The Harrow pack owned the north, and they were expanding. They needed breeding stock. They needed bloodlines. They didn't care that Ashbourne was poor. They cared that Maeve was an untouched female of alpha descent. She stepped forward. Her woolen dress was thin. The grey dye faded to the colour of dirty dishwater. The emissary finally looked at her. His eyes were flat, a pale, washed-out blue. He smelled of dried blood and stale sweat. "Put her in the wagon." The emissary grunted. 2 Harrow guards stepped out of the periphery. They didn't bother binding her hands. Where would she run? The nearest friendly village was 3 days south through territory crawling with scavengers. The wagon was a brutal, springless thing built of dark oak and iron. Maeve climbed into the back, scraping her shin against the metal latch. It bled. She watched the thick, dark drop bead on her pale skin and slide down into the mud. She felt a strange detachment. That was her blood, but it belonged to the north now. The journey took 4 days. She sat in the corner of the wagon bed, wrapped in a coarse horse blanket that smelled strongly of ammonia and dander. The rhythm of the wooden wheels over the rutted, frozen earth beat a steady, bruising tempo into her spine. Every jolt rattled her teeth. The guards didn't speak to her. Twice a day they tossed a chunk of hardtack and a skin of water into the back. She ate it mechanically, letting the dry bread dissolve against the roof of her mouth before swallowing. It tasted like sawdust and salt. Maeve slept in snatches, waking whenever the wagon hit a particularly deep pothole, or when the distant howl of a wolf split the night. In the dark, her mind didn't drift to fantasies of escape or dramatic rescues. She thought about the draft in her old bedroom. She thought about the way the smoke backed up into the kitchen when the wind blew from the east. She thought about how 60 sacks of wheat would be gone by March. They were taking her to the Alpha King. Rumours of him were traded like currency in the south. They said he had torn out the throat of his own sire to take the throne. They said he kept the skulls of rival alphas on spikes outside his solar. They said his wolf was the size of a war horse, black as pitch and utterly feral. Maeve leaned her head against the freezing iron bar of the wagon. She wasn't terrified. Terror requires energy. She was just profoundly, deeply exhausted. She wanted to sleep in a bed that wasn't moving. If he killed her, at least it would be warm blood. On the afternoon of the fourth day, the sky turned the color of a bruised plum, heavy with unspilled snow. The wagon jolted to a halt. "Get up!" A guard barked, rapping his spear against the iron grate. Maeve stood, her legs trembling from disuse and the biting cold. The blanket slipped from her shoulders, and the icy wind cut through her thin dress like glass. She grabbed the iron bars to steady herself and looked out. The fortress of House Harrow didn't loom. It crouched. It was built into the side of a jagged mountain, constructed of dark, unyielding basalt. There were no decorative banners fluttering in the wind, no polished brass gates. It was a brutalist monument to survival. Black smoke poured from a dozen thick chimneys, staining the heavy snow clouds above. The air here was different. Thinner, sharper. It smelled of crushed pine needles, wood smoke, and the metallic tang of an approaching storm. And beneath it all, the heavy, suffocating scent of a massive, apex predator pack. It made the hair on Maeve's arms stand up. The sheer weight of their collective pheromones pressed against her chest, making it hard to draw a full breath. The wagon tailboard dropped with a loud clang. "Move," the guard said, grabbing her upper arm. His grip was entirely too tight, his fingers digging into her bicep. She stumbled out, her bare feet hitting the cobblestones of the massive courtyard. The stones were slick with a thin layer of ice. Maeve slipped, falling hard onto her hands and knees. The impact jarred her shoulders, sending a sharp spike of pain up her neck. She didn't scramble to get up. She just stayed there for a second, staring at the frost-covered stone, feeling the biting cold seep into her palms. Laughter crackled from the perimeter. There were dozens of them, Harrow wolves. They stood around roaring iron braziers, watching her. They were huge, clad in thick leathers and heavy furs. "Ashbourne trash!" Someone spat. Maeve pushed herself up. Her palms were scraped red, embedded with tiny fragments of gravel. She wiped them on her dress. She kept her head down, staring at the boots of her guard. Enough. The word wasn't shouted. It wasn't a roar. It was spoken at a normal volume, yet it seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the courtyard. The laughter snapped shut. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating. Maeve saw a pair of boots step into her line of sight. Black leather, heavy, worn at the creases but meticulously oiled. The scent hit her a second later. Ozone. The sharp, clean smell of air just after a lightning strike, mixed with the deep, earthy scent of dark wood and something distinctly, terrifyingly male. Her wolf, dormant and starved for the last 2 years, suddenly stirred in her chest. She didn't cower. She flattened her ears. "You brought her in the back of a supply cart." The voice was low, gravelly but smooth. It sounded like stones grinding under deep water. "She's a breeder, my king," the guard who held her arm said. His voice, previously so arrogant, was now tight, thin. "Let go of her arm." The grip vanished instantly. Maeve stood there, shivering uncontrollably now, staring at the black boots. She realized she was bracing herself for a blow. She was waiting for the hand to grab her hair, to drag her inside. "Look at me." Maeve swallowed dryly. Slowly, agonizingly, she tilted her head up. He wasn't covered in scars or dripping with blood. He was tall, impossibly tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the braziers behind him. His hair was dark, clipped short, save for a slight unruliness at the top. But his eyes, they were a pale, startling amber. Wolf's eyes, even in human form. They were assessing, cold, but strangely devoid of the cruelty she had expected. This was Aelin, the butcher. He looked down at her. He took in her shivering frame, her torn dress, her bloody shin, her scraped palms. His jaw clenched, a muscle feathered at his temple. Maeve waited for the sneer, the disappointment that he had traded 60 sacks of wheat for a scrawny, bruised girl. He unclasped the heavy black wolf fur cloak from his shoulders. With a single, fluid motion, he stepped forward and dropped it over her. The sheer weight of it almost buckled her knees. It was still radiating his body heat. The scent of ozone enveloped her, heavy and intoxicating. "I asked for an Alpha's daughter," Aelin said, his amber eyes fixed on hers. "Not a prisoner of war." He turned to the guard. The shift in his demeanor was terrifying. He didn't raise his voice, but the sudden, suffocating pressure of his Alpha aura slammed into the courtyard. Several wolves nearby dropped to their knees, gagging. Maeve stumbled back, clutching the heavy fur around her, gasping for air. 50 lashes, Aelin said to a man standing to his left. "And he sleeps in the outer pens tonight." "Yes, Alpha," the man replied instantly. Aelin turned back to Maeve. The crushing pressure in the air vanished as quickly as it had appeared. He didn't offer her his hand. He didn't smile. "Follow me," he said, turning toward the massive oak doors of the keep. She stood frozen for a second. The cloak was so warm, it felt like a trap. Kindness usually was. But the cold wind bit at her bare ankles, and the courtyard was entirely silent, watching her. Maeve tightened her grip on the edges of the fur and walked after the butcher of House Harrow. The inside of the keep was a labyrinth of dark stone, iron sconces and narrow, winding corridors. It smelled of roasted meat and damp ash. Aelin walked quickly, his long strides forcing her to jog to keep up. He didn't look back to see if she was following. They climbed 3 flights of stairs, the air growing warmer the higher they went. Finally, he stopped before a heavy wooden door bound in iron. He pushed it open and stepped aside. Maeve hesitated on the threshold. The room was large. A massive stone fireplace dominated the far wall, a roaring fire already spitting sparks against the grate. There was a large bed draped in thick wool and furs, a heavy oak table, and a wash basin set against the wall. Steam curled from a copper pitcher beside it. It wasn't a dungeon. She stepped inside, her bare feet sinking into a thick, woven rug. She turned around. Aelin stood in the doorway, his broad frame taking up nearly the entire space. "There is hot water," he said, his voice devoid of inflection. "Soap. Fresh clothing in the chest at the foot of the bed. Food will be brought up shortly." She stared at him, her fingers white-knuckled around the edges of his cloak. Her mind was spinning, trying to find the angle. The catch. "Where do you sleep?" she asked. Her voice sounded pathetic. Raspy and small. He paused, a flicker of something. Annoyance? Amusement? Crossing his amber eyes. "In my own chambers, down the hall. She swallowed hard, hating the tremor in her chest. "You thought I bought you to toss you onto that bed tonight." He finished for her bluntly. She flinched. She couldn't help it. Her shoulders hunched up toward her ears. Aelin sighed. It was a heavy, exhausted sound that made him suddenly look much older than he was. He leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms over his chest. He was wearing a simple black tunic and trousers, but he still looked like a weapon that had just been unsheathed. Gideon of Ashbourne is a desperate, stupid man, Aelin said quietly. He bred his pack into starvation and sold his sister for grain. You are here because I need the southern packs to stop fighting amongst themselves, and tying my house to yours forces the others to back down. He pushed off the doorframe. "I don't rape terrified, starving girls, Maeve. Wash the mud off. Eat. Lock the door from the inside if it makes you feel better." He turned to leave. Maeve didn't know why she did it. It was stupid. It was a survival instinct misfiring. But the sudden removal of the threat left a vacuum in her chest, and anger rushed in to fill it. "Don't pretend you're doing me a favor," she snapped. Aelin stopped in the hallway. He turned back slowly. The air in the room grew heavy again. She took a step back, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Stupid, stupid, stupid. She clamped her teeth together, waiting for him to cross the room and strike her. She had seen Gideon backhand women for less. Ireland just looked at her. His gaze dropped to her bare, freezing feet, up to her bruised hands, and finally to her eyes, wide with panic. "I'm not doing you a favor," he said softly. "I'm doing what is necessary. Surviving isn't pretty, Maeve. You should know that better than anyone." He reached out and grabbed the iron handle of the door. "Your cloak," she said quickly, shrugging it off her shoulders. The cold air of the room hit her instantly, but she held the heavy fur out to him. He looked at the cloak, then at her. "Keep it. You're shaking." He pulled the door shut. She heard the heavy latch fall into place. Maeve stood alone in the center of the room. The fire crackled loudly. She walked over to the heavy oak door and pressed her hand against the wood. She waited for the sound of a key turning in the lock from the outside. It never came. She turned back to the room. The copper pitcher of hot water sat by the basin. A bar of actual rendered soap, not the lye and ash they used in Ashbourne, sat beside it. She walked over and touched the side of the pitcher. It was scalding hot. She dropped the heavy black cloak onto the floor. She stripped off the filthy, damp grey dress and let it pool at her feet. She poured the steaming water into the basin, picked up the soap, and began to scrub the dried mud and blood from her shins. The water turned brown almost immediately. The scent of lavender and pine rose with the steam. She scrubbed her skin until it was red and raw, focusing solely on the abrasive texture of a washcloth, the sting of the hot water against the cuts on her hands. A knock at the door made her jump, splashing dirty water onto the rug. "Food, my lady," a muffled female voice called out. "Leave it," she managed to say. She heard the clatter of a tray being set on the stone floor outside, followed by retreating footsteps. She wrapped herself in a large linen towel from the washstand and opened the door a crack. A heavy wooden tray sat there, holding a bowl of thick beef stew, a loaf of warm, dark bread, and a wedge of pale cheese. She pulled it inside and bolted the door. Maeve sat on the edge of the massive bed, still wrapped in the towel, and ate. She didn't eat delicately. She tore the bread with her teeth, using it to wipe the bowl clean. The stew was rich, flavored with salt and root vegetables. It was the best thing she had tasted in 3 years. When the bowl was empty, her stomach ached pleasantly. A heavy, lethargic exhaustion began to pull at her limbs. She walked over to the wooden chest at the foot of the bed and opened it. Inside were thick woolen shifts, a heavy fur-lined robe, and soft leather slippers. They weren't elegant. They were practical, made for the brutal northern winters. She pulled a thick linen shift over her head. It fell to her ankles, soft and impossibly warm. She looked at the bed. The furs looked soft enough to swallow her whole. But she couldn't do it. Her nerves were still humming, her wolf pacing relentlessly beneath her skin. The sudden transition from freezing mud to a warm room and a full stomach felt entirely disjointed. She didn't trust it. She didn't trust him. Instead, she picked up Aylin's heavy black cloak from the floor. She dragged it over to the stone hearth. She curled up on the woven rug, wrapping the massive fur around herself, letting the scent of ozone and dark wood cocoon her. She lay facing the heavy oak door, watching the brass bolt gleam in the firelight. She told herself she would stay awake. She would watch the door, but the fire was so warm, and the scent in the cloak was grounding, heavy, pulling her anxious mind down into the dark. She closed her eyes just for a second. The last thing she heard was the wind howling against the thick glass of the window, sounding like 100 starving wolves denied their meal. Maeve woke to the smell of cold soot and the sharp ache of stone pressing into her hip. The fire had died sometime in the night, leaving only a bed of glowing orange embers beneath a thick blanket of grey ash. The room was freezing. She pulled Aylin's heavy black cloak tighter around her shoulders, her breath pluming in the dim morning light, filtering through the frost-rimed window. Her neck was stiff. Every joint popped and ground together as she pushed herself into a sitting position on the woven rug. She looked at the massive, empty bed. The furs remained perfectly smooth, undisturbed. She had slept on the floor like a beaten dog because the floor made sense. The floor was hard and unforgiving, exactly like the world she understood. A soft bed was a vulnerability. You didn't sleep deeply when the walls of your keep were rotting. A heavy knock rattled the iron hinges of the door. Maeve scrambled backward, pressing her spine against the rough masonry of the fireplace. Her heart kicked into a frantic, uneven rhythm. "Who is it?" Her voice cracked, dry from the drafty air. "Brida, with kindling." The voice was female, rough and impatient. She hesitated. The iron bolt gleamed on the door. She had locked it. She dragged herself up, her bare feet stinging against the cold floorboards as she stepped off the rug. She pulled the bolt back. A woman pushed past her before the door was fully open. She was broad-shouldered and grey-haired, wearing a thick woolen apron over a practical brown dress. She carried an armful of split birch and a wooden bucket of water. She didn't bow. She didn't even look at her. She marched straight to the hearth, dropping the wood with a loud clatter. "Slept on the floor, did you?" Brida muttered, kicking Maeve's discarded towel out of the way. She knelt and began aggressively stoking the dying embers with an iron poker. "Suit yourself. The king's furs are wasted on southern blood anyway." Maeve stood by the door, clutching the black cloak around her throat. "I'm not southern. Ashbourne is the Midlands." Brida scoffed, blowing onto the embers until a small flame licked at the fresh birch bark. "Anything below the frost line is the south to us, girl. Means your blood is thin and your wolf is deaf." She stood up, dusting ash from her calloused hands. She finally looked at Maeve. Her eyes were sharp, missing nothing. She took in the bruised bags under Maeve's eyes, the defensive way she held her shoulders, the sheer, oversized absurdity of Aylin's cloak draped over her frame. "Wash your face," she ordered, pointing to the bucket. "There's a grey woolen dress in the chest. Put it on. The Alpha King expects you in the lower hall for breaking fast in 10 minutes. I don't know the way. Follow the smell of burning meat. You can't miss it." She turned and walked out, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind her with a definitive slam. Maeve stood alone in the creeping warmth of the new fire. Panic, cold and bright, flared in her chest. "The Alpha King expects you." Yesterday, Aylin had been a terrifying silhouette in the courtyard, a voice that commanded obedience through sheer pressure. Today she had to sit in a room with him, in the daylight, surrounded by a pack that looked at her like she was a bad investment. She dropped the cloak. It pooled on the floor, a heap of dark fur that still smelled faintly of ozone and impending storms. She broke the thin layer of ice that had formed over the wash basin with her knuckles and splashed the freezing water onto her face. It shocked the lingering sleep from her brain. It made her gasp. She found the dress Brida mentioned. It was heavy, woven from thick, oily sheep's wool that repelled water and trapped heat. It wasn't tailored. It hung on her underfed frame like a sack, the sleeves falling past her wrists. She rolled them up, the coarse fabric scratching against her sensitive, scraped palms. She pulled on the leather slippers. They were too big, slipping off her heels when she walked. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the window. Pale skin, dark circles, a mop of tangled brown hair. She didn't look like an Alpha's daughter. She looked like a refugee. She looked exactly like what Gideon had sold her as, a desperate bid for survival. Maeve opened the door and stepped out into the corridor. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone and stale torch smoke. She stood perfectly still, closing her eyes, letting her dormant wolf sift through the smells. Underneath the dampness, There was the heavy, rich scent of roasting pork and yeast. She started walking. The keep was built for war, not comfort. The stairwells were narrow, designed to force attackers into single-file lines. The arrow slits were deep and angled. Every corner felt like a choke point. She kept her back close to the wall, her footsteps muffled by the oversized leather slippers. As she descended to the lower levels, the silence of the king's corridor gave way to a low, continuous rumble. Voices, dozens of them. The clatter of iron plates, the scrape of wooden benches. She reached the bottom of a spiraling stone staircase and stopped at the threshold of the lower hall. It was cavernous. 3 long, scarred wooden tables ran the length of the room, packed with harrow wolves. The heat generated by so many massive bodies was palpable, hitting her like a physical wall. They were eating with aggressive, terrifying efficiency, tearing at loaves of bread, cutting meat with hunting knives drawn from their belts. Maeve froze in the archway. Her chest tightened. She couldn't breathe. The sheer concentration of apex predators triggered every prey instinct she possessed. Her knees locked. She wanted to turn and run back up the narrow stairs, back to the lonely, freezing room with the heavy iron bolt. Then the noise began to die down. It started near the archway and rippled outward, a wave of silence crashing down the length of the tables. Forks stopped moving. Knives hovered. Heavy heads turned. 100 pairs of wolf eyes pinned her to the stone. The silence was heavier than the noise. It pressed against her eardrums. She could smell their collective assessment, curiosity mixed with sharp, biting disdain. The scent of pine and wet earth turned sour, tinged with territorial aggression. She was an outsider, a trespasser wearing their king's brand. Maeve forced her chin up. It trembled, but she locked her jaw to stop it. She wouldn't run. If she ran, they would hunt. It was the only rule that mattered in any pack. Ashbourne. A man detached himself from the shadows near the high table at the far end of the room. He was leaner than the other harrow wolves, his hair a dirty, unwashed blonde tied back with a leather thong. He walked down the centre aisle, his boots silent on the flagstones. A ragged scar cut through his left eyebrow, pulling the skin tight. He stopped a few feet from her. He didn't bow. He leaned in, sniffing the air right by her cheek. His scent was pungent, stale sweat and old iron. "You smell like dust," he said softly, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "And fear. I thought Gideon's bloodline was supposed to be strong. You smell like a rabbit that's given up. And you smell like you haven't washed since the last thaw," she said. The words bypassed her brain completely. They just spilled out, a reflex born of surviving Gideon's drunken temper for 2 years. A low, collective murmur rippled through the hall. The blond man's smirk vanished. His eyes flashed a dangerous, solid yellow. His hand twitched toward the heavy blade strapped to his thigh. Maeve braced herself, her stomach turning to lead. She had overplayed her hand. She was a guest in name only, and she had just insulted a seasoned warrior in front of his pack. "Garrick." The single word didn't echo. It didn't need to. It cut through the tension like a straight razor. Maeve looked past Garrick's shoulder. Aelin was sitting at the high table. She hadn't even seen him in the gloom. He was leaning back in a massive, high-backed wooden chair, a scarred pewter goblet resting casually in his right hand. He was watching them. His face was entirely unreadable, a mask of cold, hard lines. "She's bleeding onto the floor," Ireland said, his amber eyes fixed on her. Maeve looked down. In her panic, she had clenched her hands into fists, driving her unfiled fingernails directly into the raw scabs on her palms from yesterday's fall. 2 dark drops of blood had fallen onto the grey flagstones. Garrick stepped back immediately, bowing his head. The territorial aggression in his scent vanished, replaced by the sharp, acrid tang of total submission. "My apologies, Alpha. Just greeting the new arrival. "Sit down, Garrick," Ireland commanded smoothly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture. The casual authority was terrifying. Garrick turned and melted back into the crowd at the tables. Ireland set his goblet down. The dull thud resonated in the quiet hall. He gestured to the empty wooden chair to his right. "Come sit. The food is getting cold." Maeve forced her legs to move. Her oversized slippers scuffed humiliatingly against the stone. Walking the length of the hall felt like walking to a scaffold. She kept her eyes fixed on the empty chair, ignoring the hostile glares burning into the sides of her head. She reached the high table and pulled the chair back. It was heavy, scraping loudly. She sat down. The wood was hard. Up close, Aelin was even more imposing. The dark tunic he wore stretched taut over the thick muscles of his chest. His scent, that sharp, intoxicating blast of ozone and dark wood, enveloped her completely, overriding the sour smells of the hall. It made her pulse flutter erratically. A wooden trencher was shoved in front of her. It was piled high with thick, bloody slices of roasted venison, roasted root vegetables swimming in fat, and a massive hunk of dark bread. She stared at it. Her stomach, empty and clenched tight with anxiety, violently rejected the idea of rich food. The sight of the red juice pooling around the meat made her throat close up. "Eat," Ireland said softly, not looking at her. He was slicing his own meat with a small, viciously sharp dagger. "I'm not hungry," she lied. Her voice sounded weak. Aelin stopped cutting. He turned his head slowly. The amber of his eyes caught the light of the roaring hearth fires. They weren't warm. They were analytical. "You are malnourished," he stated flatly. "Your cheekbones look like they're trying to tear through your skin. You weigh practically nothing. Eat the meat, Maeve. I didn't pay 60 sacks of grain for a corpse." The transactional nature of his words hit her like a slap. 60 sacks. Her pride, buried under layers of cold and terror, twitched. She picked up the heavy iron fork. Her hand was shaking so badly the tines clattered against the wooden trencher. She stabbed a piece of venison. She brought it to her mouth. It tasted of smoke, salt, and blood. It was rich, overwhelmingly so. She forced herself to chew, swallowing past the tight lump of panic in her throat. It sat heavy in her stomach, a greasy weight. "Slower," Alan instructed quietly. "You'll throw it up if you swallow it whole." She glared at the trencher, taking a smaller bite of the bread. It was dense, heavily seeded, and tasted faintly of honey. She hated that it tasted good. She hated that she was eating well while her pack back home was rationing mouldy oats. "You're thinking about Ashbourne," Aelin said. It wasn't a question. "I'm thinking about my brother. Gideon is weak," Aelin replied casually, taking a drink from his goblet. "He relies on sentiment rather than strategy. He let your southern borders collapse because he wouldn't cull the diseased herds. He traded you because he couldn't face the consequences of his own mismanagement." Her grip on the fork tightened until her knuckles turned white. "He kept us alive." "Barely." Aelin shifted his gaze back to her. "And for how long? Winter has just begun. By January, your people will be eating their own dogs." "You don't know anything about my people." The venom in her voice surprised her. It was raw, scraping against the back of her throat. Aelin didn't react to her anger. He didn't demand respect or strike her for her insolence. He simply watched her with that infuriating, calculating stare. "I know that loyalty to a sinking ship is a romantic notion, Maeve, but it still results in drowning." He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice so the surrounding tables couldn't hear. "You are in Harrow now. You will eat our food. You will wear our wool. You will survive, because if you die, I will march south and slaughter every single wolf in Ashbourne just to balance the ledger. Do you understand me?" The threat wasn't delivered with malice. It was delivered as an administrative fact. The absolute certainty in his tone chilled her to the bone. She looked into his pale, amber eyes. She didn't see a monster. She saw a man who looked at the world as a chessboard made of meat and bone. "I understand," she whispered. "Good." Aelin leaned back, dismissing the intensity of the moment as quickly as he had summoned it. He pointed at her plate with his dagger. "Finish the vegetables. We have a pack meeting in an hour. You will stand by my side, and you will not look at the floor." The courtyard was colder than the keep, the air biting relentlessly at her exposed face. The sky had bruised to a deep, iron grey, and thick, wet snowflakes had begun to fall, melting the moment they hit the muddy, frozen earth. Maeve stood on the raised wooden dais overlooking the main training yard. The wind whipped her oversized grey dress around her ankles. She kept her hands buried deep in the pockets of the wool, curling her fingers into tight, painful fists to stop the shivering. Alan stood beside her, an immovable monolith wrapped in his dark wolf furs. The entire pack was assembled below them. Nearly 400 wolves. The sheer mass of them, the combined heat of their bodies, sent a visible distortion of steam into the freezing air. They were silent, watching the dais with a collective, heavy expectation. Aelin hadn't touched her since they walked out there. He hadn't offered a reassuring glance. He treated her presence exactly as he had described it. A strategic placement. She was a prop, a living treaty. Garrick, the blonde beta from the hall, stepped forward from the front rank. He dragged a man by the scruff of his neck, throwing him roughly onto the muddy ground at the base of the dais. The man landed hard, his hands bound behind his back with thick hemp rope. He was young, maybe Maeve's age, his face bruised and bleeding from a split lip. The scent of raw, absolute terror spiked in the air, so strong it tasted like copper on her tongue. Her dormant wolf whined in the back of her mind, a pathetic sound of distress. She locked her knees. "Do not look at the floor. Do not look away." "Alpha!" Garrick called out, his voice carrying easily over the wind. The scout from the eastern ridge. He returned empty-handed, claimed the rogue pack crossed into the Deadlands and scattered. Aelin looked down at the kneeling boy. He didn't speak immediately. The silence stretched, tight as a drawn bowstring. The snowflakes caught in Aelin's dark hair. "Is that the truth, Taran?" Aelin's voice was calm, smooth. The boy, Taran, looked up. His eyes were wide, white completely visible around the irises. "Yes, Alpha, I swear it. The tracks just ended. The snow covered them. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing frantically. "I searched for 2 days. They're gone." Aelin stared at him. The air pressure around the dais shifted. It didn't drop. It compressed. The heavy, suffocating weight of his alpha aura bled out, rolling down the wooden steps and washing over the courtyard. It was purely instinctual. Maeve's chest seized, her lungs struggling to pull in the thin air. The wolves in the front row lowered their heads, submitting to the invisible force. Taran began to tremble violently. "You smell of sour wine and cheap perfume," Aelin said, his voice dropping a register, rumbling with the terrifying undertone of a growl. "You smell like the brothel in Oakhaven, not the Eastern Ridge." Taran's face drained of what little colour it had left. "Alpha, you took silver from the pack treasury to scout the border," Aelin continued, his tone devoid of rage, which somehow made it worse. "You spent it on cheap liquor and whores while a rogue pack killed 3 of our sheep and maimed a shepherd. You lied to your beta. You lied to your king." "Mercy," Taran choked out, dropping his forehead into the freezing mud. "Please, Aelin. I was cold. I just wanted one night. Please." Maeve watched Aelin's profile. There was no internal struggle, no hesitation. He didn't enjoy it, but he didn't shy away from it either. It was a terrifying kind of clarity. Aelin walked slowly down the wooden steps. His heavy boots crunched against the frost-bitten mud. The pack remained perfectly, horrifyingly still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. He stopped in front of the kneeling, sobbing boy. "Mercy is a luxury we cannot afford in winter," Aylin said quietly. He reached down. Maeve expected him to shift. She expected claws and tearing flesh, the brutal, blood-soaked violence she had heard stories of in Ashbourne. But Aylin remained entirely human. He grabbed Taran's left arm, pulling the boy up slightly by the bicep. With his other hand, Aylin grasped Taran's wrist. The movement was fast, a sharp, violent twist. The sound of bone snapping was as loud as a dry branch breaking under a heavy boot. Taran screamed. It was a high, reedy sound of absolute agony. He collapsed back into the mud, curling around his awkwardly bent forearm, sobbing uncontrollably. Maeve flinched. Her whole body jerked backward an inch. She clamped her teeth down hard on the inside of her cheek to stop herself from crying out. The taste of her own blood filled her mouth, warm and metallic. Aylin didn't look at the writhing boy. He looked up at the pack. "He will sleep in the outer pens without a fire for 3 nights," Aylin announced, his voice carrying clearly over Taran's pathetic whimpers. "Garrick will set the bone. If it heals crooked, he holds a sword with his right hand. If anyone else decides the treasury is their personal coin purse, I will break both." He turned and walked back up the stairs. The pack remained silent, their heads bowed respectfully. No one moved to help Taran as he wept in the mud. Aylin stepped back onto the dais, taking his place beside Maeve. His chest was rising and falling in an even, steady rhythm. He wasn't flushed. He wasn't breathing heavily. He had just shattered a man's arm with his bare hands, and his pulse hadn't even quickened. He looked at her out of the corner of his eye. He saw the pale horror in her face, the rigid tension in her jaw. "Cruel?" he asked softly, just loud enough for her to hear over the wind. She swallowed the blood in her mouth. She didn't look at him. She looked at the boy bleeding in the mud. "Barbaric." "Effective," Aylin corrected smoothly. "He is alive. He will learn. And 400 wolves just remembered why they follow my orders instead of their own impulses. In Ashbourne, Gideon would have yelled at him, thrown a mug at the wall, and the boy would have done it again next week." She wanted to argue. She wanted to defend her brother, her home. But the words turned to ash in her throat. Because Aylin was right. Gideon had let a guard steal half their winter meat stores last year because he didn't have the stomach to punish him in front of the pack. They had starved for it. "I am not a monster, Maeve," Aylin said, looking out over the sea of bowed heads. The snow was falling harder now, clinging to the broad shoulders of his dark fur cloak. "I am a dam holding back a flood. You think I am the worst thing in the north? You have no idea what waits in the dark if I let this pack fracture." He finally turned to look at her fully. His pale amber eyes were intense, pinning her in place. "You survived Gideon's weakness," Aylin murmured. "Now you will learn to survive my strength." He turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors of the keep, leaving her standing alone on the dais, shivering in the cold, watching the blood mix with the falling snow. The days bled into a rhythm of grey skies and biting cold. Maeve learned quickly that the Harrow Keep was an organism. It breathed smoke, consumed massive quantities of meat, and sweated tension. No one locked her in her room. There were no guards stationed at her door. Aylin's word was absolute, and he had claimed her. Therefore, the pack treated her like a loaded weapon left on a table, dangerous to touch, unnerving to ignore. They didn't speak to her. When she walked the narrow stone corridors, wolves would step aside, pressing their backs against the damp walls, their eyes dropping to the floor. It wasn't respect. It was fear of the butcher's wrath should they accidentally slight his new acquisition. By the 5th day, the isolation began to gnaw at the edges of her sanity. In Ashbourne, she had been starved, but she had never been invisible. She found the washhouse by following the thick, choking scent of boiling lye and wet wool. It was located in the lowest levels of the keep, a cavernous, vaulted stone cellar filled with dense clouds of steam. 6 women stood over massive iron cauldrons, stirring the boiling water with long, stripped pine poles. The heat in the room was oppressive, a stark, violent contrast to the freezing courtyards above. Brida was there, her grey hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, her thick arms hauling a basket of sodden tunics. Maeve didn't announce herself. She walked past the drying racks, stripped off Arlen's heavy wolf fur cloak, and folded it neatly on a dry bench. She rolled the sleeves of her oversized grey dress past her elbows. Her hands were finally starting to heal, the scabs on her palms turning into hard, pink scars. She stepped up to the nearest empty washing trough. A pile of bloody, mud-caked leggings sat beside it. She grabbed a block of harsh, yellow lye soap, submerged the top pair of leggings into the scalding water, and began to scrub. The woman working the cauldron next to her froze. Her pine pole slipped, clattering against the iron rim. The sound cut through the noise of the boiling water. Slowly, the other women stopped working. They stared at Maeve through the thick steam. "What are you doing?" Brida demanded, dropping her basket. It hit the wet flagstones with a wet slap. "Scrubbing," Maeve said. She didn't look up. She dragged the coarse fabric against the wooden washboard. The lye bit into the fresh skin of her hands immediately, a sharp chemical sting. It felt grounding, real. "You're the Alpha King's woman," Brida said, stepping closer. Her voice was a mix of confusion and irritation. "You don't wash blood from leather. Get out of here before Garrick sees you and thinks we put you to work. He'll have our hides." "I'm not his woman," Maeve replied evenly, bearing down on a particularly dark stain on the knee of the leggings. "I'm a treaty, and treaties don't sit in empty rooms staring at the wall until they go mad. In Ashbourne, if you didn't work, you didn't eat. You eat from the high table," Brida snapped, wiping her hands on her apron. "And it tastes like ash when I haven't earned it." Maeve shot back, finally looking at her. The steam curled between them. "I know how to render fat. I know how to mend chainmail links. I know how to scrub mud. I am not a porcelain doll, Brida. I am from the Midlands. We don't shatter." Brida stared at her. Her sharp, dark eyes scanned Maeve's face, looking for the lie, looking for the fragile southern princess she had expected. She looked at Maeve's raw, red hands plunging repeatedly into the scalding water without a flinch. She grunted. It was a low, rough sound deep in her chest. "The blood needs cold water first, girl," Brida muttered, turning back to her cauldron. "Hot water sets the iron in the stain. Dump that trough and start over. And use the bristle brush on the leather, not the pumice." A knot Maeve hadn't realized she was carrying in her chest loosened a fraction. "Thank you." She spent the next 4 hours in the blistering heat. The physical labor was a mercy. It quieted the frantic pacing of her inner wolf. Her muscles burned, her knuckles bled from the rough bristles, and her hair clung to her neck in damp, sweaty tendrils. She smelled of cheap soap, copper, and wet dog. She felt more like herself than she had since the wagons arrived at Ashbourne. She was hauling a heavy wooden bucket of dirty water toward the drainage grate when the air in the cellar shifted. The oppressive heat of the steam suddenly felt suffocating, pushed down by a crushing atmospheric pressure. The women around her dropped their brushes and poles. They fell to their knees on the wet stones, bowing their heads so low their noses nearly touched the dirty water pooling on the floor. Maeve stood there, the heavy bucket pulling at her aching shoulders. Alan walked through the low archway. He wasn't wearing his heavy furs. He wore a simple, dark linen shirt, the sleeves pushed up over his forearms, revealing thick bands of corded muscle and a lattice of faded silver scars. He looked massive in the low-ceilinged room. His pale amber eyes swept over the kneeling women, dismissing them instantly, before locking onto her. The scent of ozone crashed into the smell of lye, overwhelming it entirely. Her dormant wolf snapped to attention, her ears perking up, pacing wildly against her ribs. Alan didn't yell. He walked slowly across the slippery stones. He stopped 2 feet away from her. He looked at the heavy bucket in her hands. He looked at her soaked, ruined dress. He looked at the fresh blood welling from a scraped knuckle. "What are you doing, Maeve?" His voice was dangerously quiet, a low rumble that vibrated in her chest cavity. "I'm pouring out dirty water." "You are the daughter of an alpha," Aelin stated, his jaw clenching. "You do not scrub the mud off the boots of my foot soldiers." "I am a commodity bought for 60 sacks of wheat," she corrected, her voice remarkably steady despite the tremor in her legs. "Commodities don't have titles." A muscle feathered at his temple. "Put the bucket down." "It's heavy," she said, a strange, reckless defiance flaring in her blood. "If I put it down here, it will spill, and Breda will have to clean it up." Aelin's eyes darkened, the pale amber turning the color of burnt sugar. He stepped closer. The heat radiating off his body was intense, overpowering the steam of the wash-house. He reached out and grabbed the thick rope handle of the bucket, his large, calloused hand brushing against her raw knuckles. The contact sent a literal shock up her arm. It wasn't a metaphor. It felt like static electricity, sharp and biting. She gasped, her grip loosening instantly. He took the heavy bucket from her with one hand, as easily as if it were a teacup. He didn't break eye contact as he effortlessly upended it over the iron drainage grate. The dirty water splashed loudly, swirling down into the dark. He dropped the bucket. It clattered against the stone. "Walk with me," Aelin commanded. He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and strode towards the archway. Maeve looked at Breda, who was still kneeling, her face pale. She grabbed the oversized black wolf fur cloak from the bench, threw it over her damp shoulders, and followed the Alpha King out of the steam and into the cold. They stepped out into the lower courtyard. The cold was an immediate, physical blow. Thick, wet snow spiraled down from an iron-grey sky, clinging to her damp dress and freezing the coarse wool to her shins. Aelin didn't look back. "You are trying to shame me," he said, his boots crushing the frost-heaved mud. "By scrubbing leather like an Omega, you signal to my pack that I treat my treaty-bound guests like slaves. I'm trying to stay sane." Maeve wrapped his heavy black cloak tighter around her shoulders, shivering violently. "I don't know how to sit in a warm room and embroider while men freeze outside. It feels like rotting." He stopped and wheeled around. The snow caught in his dark hair. "I gave you a fire. I gave you food. I gave you safety. You gave me a cage!" The shout scraped her throat raw. 2 guards near the armory flinched, their hands dropping to their sword hilts. She lowered her voice, her chest heaving. "A gilded cage is still a cage. You paraded me out to let them smell my fear, then locked me in a tower. They look at me like I'm a loaded trap. They look at you with caution because you belong to me." Aelin growled. He closed the distance between them in 2 massive strides. The heat rolling off his body was oppressive, a stark contrast to the freezing wind. "If they touch you, they lose a hand. That isn't a cage, Maeve. That is a fortress." "I don't want a fortress." She dug her fingernails into her palms, welcoming the sting. "If I am going to survive this frozen hellscape, I need a purpose. In Ashbourne, if you didn't work, you died." He stared at her, a muscle feathering tight along his jaw. His alpha aura pressed down, heavy and suffocating, making her lungs burn. She thought he might strike her. Then the iron horn on the western watchtower blew. It wasn't a call to arms. It was a single, ragged blast. The sound of a wounded beast. Aelin's anger vanished. His eyes snapped toward the heavy oak gates. The suffocating pressure in the air evaporated, replaced by cold, razor-sharp calculation. The gates groaned open, spitting a chaotic mass of bodies onto the snowy cobblestones. 8 wolves. They weren't marching. They were dragging each other. The smell hit the courtyard before the blood did. It was a physical wall of terror, punctured bowels, and the sweet, heavy copper tang of severed arteries. "Medic!" Aylin's roar shattered the freezing air. He was already sprinting across the mud. Maeve didn't run back to the keep. The instinct to hide was violently suppressed by 2 years of surviving Gideon's border skirmishes. Blood meant pressure. Blood meant boiling water and silk thread. She hiked up the wet skirts of her heavy dress and ran after him. The great hall had been transformed into an abattoir. Wolves violently cleared the long wooden tables, sending pewter mugs and trenchers clattering to the flagstones. Screams bounced off the vaulted stone ceiling. 3 keep healers darted through the chaos, their aprons already soaked red. Maeve followed the deepest pool of blood to a table near the hearth. A guard was thrashing on the wood, his abdomen laid open. The slick grey loops of his intestines were slipping through a healer's frantic, bloody fingers. He was screaming in a high, reedy pitch that drilled directly into her teeth. "Hold him down!" the healer shrieked at a paralyzed young boy standing nearby. Maeve didn't hesitate. She dropped Aylin's cloak onto the blood-slick floor. She vaulted onto the edge of the table, straddling the thrashing man's massive right thigh. She grabbed his flailing arm, interlacing her fingers with his bloody ones, and slammed her entire body weight down onto his shoulder. "Hold his left side!" She screamed at the frozen boy. "Do it now or he dies!" The boy jolted, throwing himself over the wolf's left ribs. The wounded man arched his spine, trying to throw her off, but she clamped her knees tight around his thigh and dug her elbows into his collarbone. The air smelled of voided bowels and absolute panic. "Needles, silk thread, now!" the healer yelled. For the next 2 hours, the world shrank to the size of a wooden table. Maeve's hands turned dark red. The blood dried into tight, itchy crusts on her forearms. She held limbs steady while a bone saw chewed through cartilage. She pressed wads of linen against spurting arteries until her shoulders screamed in agony. She didn't shake. She didn't cry. She fell into a cold, mechanical numbness. She knew how to hold a man while he screamed. When the screaming finally subsided into wet, rattling moans, she leaned against a stone pillar. Her chest heaved. Her dress was stiff with gore, glued to her legs. A shadow blocked the light of the hearth. Aylin stood there. He was covered in arterial spray, his tunic ripped, a smear of soot across his cheek. He looked exactly like the monster the Southern Packs claimed him to be. But his pale amber eyes weren't feral. They were entirely focused on her. He looked at her bloody hands. He looked at the rigid line of her jaw. He didn't see a fragile Southern prize. He saw a wolf who hadn't broken. He stepped closer, reaching out to gently touch her blood-caked wrist. "You didn't run," he murmured, his voice hoarse from shouting. "Nowhere to run to," she rasped. His amber eyes dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. The metallic scent of blood mixed with his deep ozone pheromones, heavy and grounding. Gideon was a fool. Aylin breathed, his thumb brushing over her stained knuckles. "He didn't sell me a treaty, Maeve. He sold me a queen." The water in the basin turned the color of old rust. Maeve scrubbed her forearms with a pumice stone until the skin screamed, but the phantom slickness of blood wouldn't wash off. The keep was agonizingly quiet now. The screaming had stopped hours ago, replaced by the suffocating scent of burning sage and cauterized flesh that seeped under her heavy oak door. 4 dead. She had held down a man while they sawed through his femur, and now the silence of her room felt like a physical weight pressing against her eardrums. Her hands shook. She couldn't stop them. The adrenaline that had kept her spine rigid in the great hall was gone, leaving behind a hollow, vibrating exhaustion. She sat on the edge of the oversized bed, wrapped in a coarse woolen blanket, and stared at her knuckles. They were split open from the harsh lie in the washhouse and stained brown from the gore in the hall. A single rap of knuckles against wood made her flinch. Not a guard's pounding, just one heavy strike. Aylin. His voice filtered through the heavy timber. Flat, drained. She didn't want him to see her shaking. She wiped her wet face aggressively with the back of her hand, swallowing the tight lump of panic in her throat, and walked barefoot across the cold stone floor. She pulled the iron bolt back. He stepped inside, bringing the scent of pine needles, sharp ozone, and the bitter cold of the courtyard with him. The blood was gone from his face. His dark hair was damp, but it was his shoulders that caught her attention. They slumped just a fraction of an inch. The terrifying alpha aura that usually choked the air out of a room was entirely retracted. He didn't look like a king. He looked like a man who had spent the last 10 hours digging graves in frozen mud. He held a small, dark glass jar in his left hand. 4 wolves died, he said to the stone hearth, avoiding her eyes. 5 widows. 9 pups who will go hungry if the winter is long. Maeve pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Why are you telling me this? Because they expect me to be a monolith, Aelin murmured, turning his head slowly. The shadows under his pale amber eyes looked like bruises. If I show exhaustion, the pack panics. If I mourn, they fracture. I am not allowed to bleed. He walked toward her. She didn't step back. The terror she had felt in the courtyard days ago felt like a distant, childish memory. He stopped an arm's length away and held out the jar. Give me your hands. They're fine, she lied, hiding them under the wool. Maeve. The command was soft, but it brooked no argument. She slowly extended her hands. They trembled visibly in the dim firelight. Aelin didn't mock the tremor. He set the jar on the edge of the washstand, unscrewed the lid, and scooped out a dollop of thick yellow paste. It smelled sharply of beeswax and crushed comfrey. He took her right hand. His grip was impossibly gentle. This was the man who had shattered a scout's arm without a change in his heart rate. Now his calloused thumb moved with agonizing care, rubbing the heavy, earthy salve over her cracked knuckles and raw palms. The intense heat of his skin sank into her aching joints. I hated you, she whispered. The words tasted like ash, but they needed to be said. When you bought me, I thought you were exactly what the stories said. A butcher. I am a butcher. Aelin replied quietly, moving to her left hand. He kept his eyes focused entirely on her skin. No, she countered, her voice steadying. I saw Gideon's version of mercy. It starved us. It let the rot set in. Your cruelty. It's just a wall. You use it to keep the wolves fed. You keep the monsters out. Aelin stopped rubbing the salve. His thumb rested heavily against her pulse point at the base of her wrist. He looked up. His amber eyes were stripped of their cold calculation, revealing a raw, starving intensity beneath. I am the monster, Maeve. He growled, the deep vibration echoing in the quiet room. Don't mistake me for a savior. If the southern packs cross my border, I will slaughter them. I will do whatever it takes to keep this keep standing. I stood in your great hall and held a man down while he bled out, she said, leaning closer, her chin lifting in pure defiance. I didn't close my eyes. I didn't run. Do you honestly think I'm afraid of the dark, Aelin? I was raised in it. A ragged breath tore through his teeth. The control snapped. He didn't kiss her gently. He kissed her like a man who was drowning and had finally found the surface. His mouth crashed down on hers, rough and demanding. His large hands abandoned the salve, sliding up to grip her jaw, holding her face still as he devoured her mouth. It tasted of smoke, bitter herbs, and sheer, violent desperation. Maeve dropped the woolen blanket. It pooled at her feet. She grabbed the front of his tunic, twisting the heavy fabric in her fists, pulling him closer until there was no air between them. His body was a furnace against the freezing chill of the room. Her internal wolf didn't cower or submit. She clawed her way to the surface, meeting his dominance with a frantic, answering fire. The heavy impact of his chest drove her backward until her spine hit the cold stone of the wall. He groaned, a deep, guttural sound, his lips leaving her mouth to drag hot, open-mouthed kisses down the side of her neck. His teeth scraped her skin, right over her thundering pulse. "You are mine." He breathed against her throat, the words heavy with alpha command and undeniable possessiveness. "I'm a treaty," she gasped, tangling her fingers in his damp hair, tugging his face back up to hers. Aelin let out a dark, breathless laugh. "The treaty," he whispered, his amber eyes burning into hers, "is officially broken." And that concludes the intense, blood-soaked beginnings of Maeve and Aelin's story. From a starved political prisoner to a queen forged in the brutal north, Maeve's journey proves that sometimes the only way to survive the dark is to become the monster's equal. Did this gritty, grounded werewolf romance hook you? If you loved the raw tension and want more fiercely human stories, hit that like button and share this video with your pack. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new release. Drop a comment below. Would you have scrubbed the bloody armor in the wash house or stayed locked in the tower? Let us know, and we'll see you in the next dark tale.